Hi everyone. So today we're going to be talking about the 3 levels of dependent arising, which is in chapter 1 of your book, A Commentary on Lama Tsongkhapa's Praise to Dependent Arising by Geshe Ngawang Samten. So in chapter 1 it describes in detail, and we'll go through some of that. But the main thing to understand is that the levels of dependent arising go related to subtlety, and today I'll be presenting from the subtlest view, the middle way consequence view, and then we'll go back and look at some of the lower Tenets schools eventually, here and there where they differ. So the first level is dependent upon causes and conditions. So remembering that a substantial cause is whatever is the main thing that turns into a result. For example, wood is the substantial cause of a table. The carpenter is a cooperative condition. The discussion of causes and conditions is very much related to the discussion of karma. Karma refers to the mental factor of intention or volition. When either virtuous or non-virtuous intention arises in the mind stream of an ordinary being, such ethically potent intention leaves propensities, or karmic seeds, upon the mental consciousness. Such seeds in turn, once awakened, produce effects commiserate with their ethical value. So then a condition is an impermanent entity that assists causes in producing their effects, or in particular a cooperative condition, that which produces an effect that exists outside its own substantial continuum, that which produces the attributes of the basis constituting the effect instead of the basis of those attributes. So this discussion of causes and conditions is related to the first level of dependent arising. And this relates to all impermanent phenomena, things that change moment to moment. The next level is dependent upon parts and context. And this is related to both permanent and impermanent phenomena, all phenomena. All phenomena are dependent upon their parts in order to exist, and is another reason why they do not exist inherently. For example, we merely label the body in dependence upon the parts, the legs, the arms, the head, etc. There is no body separate from the parts it's labeled onto. Similarly, all phenomena are dependent upon context. You can say that you are a tall person only related to someone who is shorter. You can say this is a small room only because other rooms exist that are larger. So everything exists in dependence upon parts and context, which is another proof for their being empty of inherent existence. The last level, which is the most subtle, is that all phenomena are dependent upon their basis of designation and the mind's imputation. So you need a basis and you need a mind to label. And the valid basis to label must be in accordance with worldly convention. So I can't say that the singing bowl is an elephant, because that's not in alignment with worldly convention. But I can say it's a merely labeled singing bowl based on the invention of them, the use of them, it fulfilling the characteristics of it, but not from its own side. I could also put soup in it. So, etc., etc. That's a bad example, but you understand where we're going. If you'd like to review that section about the criteria for a valid basis, see Virtue and Reality, pages 80 to 83. So the subtlest view of dependent arising relies on a mind's imputation on a valid basis. A valid basis relies on not being harmed by worldly conventions. Lama Zopa Rinpoche elaborates by saying there are 3 things required for something to exist: a valid base, not receiving harm from another's valid mind, and not receiving harm from the wisdom realizing emptiness. To say receiving harm, he means that the conception of it or the perception of it is not destroyed by those. So we'll start to unpack it a little more. Here we go. The meaning of dependent arising, from Chapter 1, A Commentary on Lama Tsongkhapa's Praise of Dependent Arising, by Yönten. Dependent arising means that phenomena are dependent on other factors, causes, and conditions in order to come into existence. This way of existing automatically dispels the extreme view of permanence because a dependent arising comes into existence in dependence on other factors, and so therefore cannot be independent, permanent, or truly existent. So remember that in Buddhism, permanent has the connotation of static, sometimes has the connotation of eternal, but really it means non-momentary. And so if we look at dependent arising, the way in which things are built upon or coming into existence because of causes and conditions, then it automatically helps us let go of this grasping. Continuing with the text, also dependent arising contradicts non-existence, because if something arises in dependence on other factors, having come into existence in this way, it cannot be completely non-existent. So within the understanding of dependent arising lies the power to dispel the two extreme views of true existence and complete non-existence, or sometimes called eternalism and nihilism. Expressed another way, if something were truly existent, it would be completely independent and permanent and could not rely on any other factor in order to come into existence. On the other hand, one could fall into the opposite extreme view by thinking if something is not truly existent, it is therefore completely non-existent and utterly unable to perform a function. In this way, too, the view of dependent arising contradicts both of the extreme views of true existence and complete non-existence. So this term true existence we haven't talked about as much. We usually say inherent existence, but in this context they are synonymous, although sometimes the different tenet schools will use the terms differently. There are two processes involved in the idea of dependent arising. In Tibetan, the term dependent arising is composed of two syllables, den, drel. Of these syllables, den corresponds to dependent, indicating that things exist in dependence on other factors. Those factors could be causes and conditions, the parts and the whole, and dependence on being deposited through the process of labeling. Such dependence negates the idea that something could exist from its own side, through its own power, and be completely independent of any other factor. All phenomena must rely or depend on other factors to exist. The second word in the term, arising, corresponds to drel in Tibetan. If something is an arising, this means that it arises due to its relationship with something else. If the proper causes and conditions, the parts, and the process of being merely labeled all come together, then a phenomena can arise. And if something actually comes into existence through the process of causes and conditions, parts, and being merely labeled, then it arises in a way that negates the view of complete non-existence, because there is something existent that is arising due to this process of the collection of the appropriate factors. So these two words together, dependent arising, or den drel in Tibetan, have the power to counter the two extreme wrong views of complete true existence and complete non-existence. This is the power of dependent arising. There are three main meanings of the first word, dependence. The first meaning of dependence is a meeting or a coming together. The second meaning is reliance, as in something being contingent on something else. Contingent meaning occurring or existing only if certain circumstances are the case. The third meaning is dependence as we would generally understand it, something being dependent on something else and therefore not independent. This first understanding of dependence as being a meeting refers to causes and their results. However, meeting in this context does not mean that the cause and the result actually meet. It is impossible for the cause and result to meet. In order for the result to come into existence, the cause must become non-existent, or finished, or exhausted. As soon as the result comes about, the cause has ceased. Therefore, no meeting between the cause and result can occur. That is not what meeting refers to here. Instead, in this first understanding of dependence, meeting refers to the function of the destruction of the cause and the generation of the result occurring simultaneously at the same time. Consider the example of a seed and a sprout. It is through the function of the seed being destroyed that the function of the plant sprouting comes about. This is the meeting of those two functions, the function of the destruction of the seed and the function of the generation of the plant within one moment of time. So the seed and the sprout analogy is used a lot in a lot of different texts, and so it's important to understand what it's referring to. We might have this idea in our head of the seed still existing when the sprout sprouts, but actually that's just the husk, it's the outside. So the idea is that the second that the seed bursts into a sprout, the seed part is done, it's finished. And that changeover from seed to sprout happens simultaneously. And this is important in understanding the first meaning of dependent arising, what meeting refers to in this context. Another analogy for this same line of reasoning is that of scales. So cause and effect existing simultaneously, but as one finishes, the other begins, just like the two sides of a scale. As one goes up, the other goes down. It's not one and then the other. They happen simultaneously. So the key thing here is to understand that cause and effect are mutually dependent. There is only such thing as a cause if there's such thing as an effect, and they're dependent on one another for their arising and for their cessation. Some lower schools of Buddhism take this understanding of dependence, the dependence on causes and conditions that lead to a result, to be the meaning of dependent arising. Meaning the only meaning of dependent arising. Nothing subtler, nothing deeper, they just leave it there. The higher schools, too, posit this as a meaning of dependent arising. It is common to all schools, but the lower schools posit this as the only meaning, having no higher understanding of dependent arising. The lower schools posit composite phenomena to exist by means of dependent arising, in the sense that they come about through causes and conditions. Looking again at the example of the seed and the sprout, it is only through the destruction of the seed that the sprout is able to come into existence. As soon as the sprout exists, there is no more seed. The seed changes moment by moment until finally there is no seed and a sprout has come into existence. Without that destruction, there can be no production. Without that momentary change and that eventual destruction of the seed, there can be no sprout, no result. If the seed did not change moment by moment, then it follows that it would always produce its effect. For instance, an apple tree only produces an apple in suitable conditions, not in all seasons. Some fruit are grown in summer and some in winter. As mentioned before, at no time does the seed exist at the same time as the sprout. However, the function of the destruction of the seed and the function of the growing of the sprout do not exist at the same time. It is this dependently arising relationship that the lower Buddhist schools assert to be dependent arising. The problem with holding only this grossest understanding of dependent arising is that it does not account for permanent phenomena, such as uncompounded space, a generic image, and emptiness itself. This is because permanent phenomena do not rely on causes and conditions. Therefore, they cannot be explained by the process of dependence on causes and conditions. From the lower school's point of view, permanent phenomena are not included in the category of the dependently arisen, because the explanation that through the destruction of the causes and conditions the result comes about does not apply to permanent phenomena. Such an explanation can only apply to produced impermanent phenomena. The second understanding of the word dependence, the idea of reliance, refers to phenomena being contingent on its parts. All phenomena, both permanent and impermanent, exist in reliance upon the collection of their parts. This second understanding of dependence is far more inclusive than the first, because it encompasses all phenomena, both permanent and impermanent. This understanding of dependence is also accepted by the mind-only school and the middle way autonomous school. The understanding of dependent arising as reliance can be applied to any example of permanent phenomena. Considering uncompounded space, it possesses parts such as north, south, east, and west. We are able to point to the different directions of the uncompounded, unobstructed space that exists in a cup. One can point to the east, west, north, south, bottom, and top of that unobstructed space. So even though unobstructed space is a permanent phenomena, it depends on its parts and the collection of those parts in order to exist. The same applies to a generic image, which can also be divided into its parts. It goes without saying that impermanent, produced phenomena are also dependent on their parts and the collection of those parts. Take the cup as an example. It is quite obvious that many different parts of that cup must come together for the cup to exist. A multitude of atomic and subatomic particles come together to form a cup. It possesses many different parts, including the handle, base, sides of the cup, and directions. Thus, it is quite obvious that produced, impermanent phenomena are dependent on their parts and the collection of those parts. So from the Mahayana Buddhist point of view, no matter how microscopically you delve into the level of subatomic particles, you can never find a particle so small that it cannot be divided into parts. No partless particle can ever be found to exist. Some non-Buddhists believe that you can actually find a final particle that is partless. They posit that it is the collection of these foundational partless particles that act as a basis upon which phenomena come together in a permanent way. They say permanent because these first foundational particles can be found. The Mahayana Buddhist view, however, is that no matter how small the particle you discover, you can never find one to be partless, as they do not exist. Two different non-Buddhist views on this topic can be explored here. One asserts that the partless particle to be the first cause. This view holds that it is possible to trace everything back to a first partless particle, and from this first partless particle, all other phenomena have come into existence. The other non-Buddhist view here posits some sort of creator as the final cause. This view traces all phenomena back to a first permanent cause that is a creator god like Ishvara, who then creates everything else. Buddhists hold that there is no permanent cause because a permanent thing could not have the ability to create or produce anything. The assertion of a permanent first cause contains numerous faults, and many questions arise. For example, for a result to be produced by a cause, that cause must change to become non-existent or be destroyed before the result can come about. If that first cause were permanent, then how could a result come about? How is that result empowered? The other obvious question that arises is, from where did this first cause come? How did it arise? A further fault is that if a result were to come about from a permanent first cause, then that result itself would not be able to change, and it would exist forever. Furthermore, any result could arise from that cause. There would be no relationship between cause and result because the cause would always exist. For example, if it were possible for an apple to come about from a permanent seed, then you could also posit that a mango could arise from that permanent apple seed, because there would be no direct relationship between the cause and the effect. Thus, any cause could give rise to any effect. Why? This is because the effect too would be permanent. The result would have come completely independent of causes and conditions coming together, since if the cause were permanent, the result also would have to be permanent. So if there were no reliance on specific causes and conditions coming together, then any result could come about from any cause. There would be randomness. It is clear that if you posit a permanent first cause, then many problems and questions arise that remain unanswered. The third understanding of dependent within dependent arising is the idea of dependence upon the process of being merely labeled by the mind. There is a basis upon which one labels, and a mind which labels onto that basis. And in dependence upon these two, the labeled phenomena comes into existence. It is in this way that phenomena are dependent on merely being labeled by the mind. This final understanding of dependence is completely unique to the highest Buddhist philosophical school, the consequentialist school of the middle way, or Prasangika Madhyamaka. And now a summary from Emptiness by Geshe Teshi Sering in the Foundation of Buddhist Thought series. The three levels of dependent arising. Dependent arising means being created in dependence on other factors, such as causes and conditions, and so refers to all impermanent phenomena. There are three levels of dependent arising. Causal dependency, what we spoke about related to causes and conditions. That's just for impermanent phenomena. Mutual dependency, rely on parts and/or context. This is for both permanent and impermanent. And merely labeled dependency, rely on a valid basis of designation and mind's imputation, and this is for both permanent and impermanent. Causal dependency. The first level of dependent arising is gross compared to the second and third levels. Gross in that it is relatively easy to understand how result depends on cause. Without a cause, the result cannot happen. In many of his sutras, including the many kinds of elements, the Buddha reiterates one of his most important ideas. When this exists, that comes to be. With the arising of this, that arises. When this does not exist, that does not come to be. With the cessation of this, that ceases. These lines are so profound and crucial because they clearly explain dependent arising. Things come into being in dependence on other things and events. Conversely, things cease in dependence on other things and events. In Buddhist terms, dependent arising within cyclic existence is shown by the 12 links of dependent origination that we have already discussed briefly. The explanation of how we cycle in samsara due to the ever-repeating chains of cause and effects. We are reborn again and again because we crave rebirth. And we do that because we have form and feelings. And that comes about because we have consciousness and karma. And that comes from ignorance. And so ignorance creates craving, creates karma, creates delusions, and suffering creates rebirth, and so on over and over and over again forever until we can break the chain. From the point of view of causal dependency, dependent arising means that each result is completely dependent on causes. This can apply to all impermanent phenomena, but every Buddhist master, from the Buddha to Nagarjuna to His Holiness the Dalai Lama, has emphasized that the main focus of our investigation should be on what is most important to us, how to overcome pain and difficulties and experience happiness and joy. Nagarjuna's famous text, Fundamental Wisdom, starts by praising the Buddha because he taught dependent arising. In chapter 24, there is an examination of the Four Noble Truths. In chapter 26, an elaboration of the Four Noble Truths when he examines the 12 links of dependent origination. I feel that in order to overcome suffering and achieve happiness, we need to understand dependent arising on all the different levels, but particularly on this level of causal dependency. It shouldn't be underestimated, and we shouldn't skip a deep understanding of this level, thinking that the subtler levels are more important. In fact, causal dependency is Nagarjuna's main argument to explain the noble truths of complete cessation, of suffering, and its origin. He uses causal dependency to show how the 12 links of dependent origination operate within us in both forward and reverse order. Moving from first to last, from ignorance to karma and so on, he shows how each comes into being produced from the previous. And in reverse order, from last to first, he shows how each can be extinguished by eliminating the former. We can thus come to understand that the complete cessation of suffering and its origin is really possible for us. And for Nagarjuna and the Prasangika masters, that kind of complete cessation within our mind stream is possible because the dependently arisen mind is empty of inherent nature. Mutual dependency. A chair depends on its parts, the seat, the back, and the legs. The whole depends on the parts. Prasangika Madhyamaka, however, says that there is mutual dependency where, reciprocally, the parts also depend on the whole. Causal dependency can be mutual dependency, but causal dependency looks at it from a grosser level, in that existence or result is dependent on the causes. That is how we normally understand it. But on a deeper level, particularly from the point of view of Prasangika, causal dependency itself is mutual dependency. The existence of the result is not only dependent on the cause, but the existence of the cause is dependent on the result. In order to say that such and such is a cause, you have to have the result of that cause. You have to explain that cause from the result's point of view. An apple seed is only an apple seed, dependent on its result, the apple. Without the apple, the cause cannot be an apple seed. So causal dependency at a deeper level can be mutual dependency, and these levels of dependent arising are not mutually exclusive. The condition by which causal dependency could not be mutual dependency, or vice versa. In one way, every adjective points to a mutual dependency. Nagarjuna in his Precious Garland says, "When this is, that arises, like short when there is long." Short and tall are mutually dependent. Identifying as short relies on at least a countering concept of tall. One relies on the other. If there is no tall, how can there be short? Imagine we are standing at opposite sides of the room. To me, I am here and you are there. But obviously, to you, the situation is reversed. You are here and I am there. Here and there definitely exist, but there is no real independently existent here and there. They only exist in relation to each other. If I were to walk to the other side of the room, that would become here, and where I am now would become there. Only when here is, there is. In other words, this is only because that is. These are relative terms that function in our daily life, but only in relation to something else. And so it is with all phenomena. Things come into being depending on existent conditions. In his The Fundamental Wisdom of the Middle Way, Nagarjuna makes three important pairings: here and there, near and far, self and other. Each pair is dependent on the other. Just as there can be no here without there, far is irrelevant unless it is coupled with the concept of near. I am not tall, but I am compared to a child. A tree is taller than me, but it is short compared to a skyscraper. For there to be tall, there must be short. For there to be near, there must be far. But of course, the most important idea is of self and other. This I we see as concrete and unchanging is of course only an I to one person. To someone speaking to you, it is a you. To a stranger, it is a him or a her. And in fact, self can only be posited in relation to other. This is part of the process of the mind training technique called equalizing and exchanging oneself with others, where we train to break down the preconceptions that me and mine are somehow inherently more important than others. On this level, mutual dependency is quite simple to understand. Yet on the level of mutual causal dependency, where cause depends on result, and result depends on cause, isn't so obvious. The other schools assert that causal dependency only occurs in one direction, that a result depends on a cause, but a cause does not depend on a result. Smoke comes into being dependent on fire, but fire does not come into being dependent on smoke. For prasangikas, smoke depends on fire to come into being, obviously. But so too does fire depend on smoke to come into being. When the other Buddhist philosophical schools deny that the existence of fire is dependent on smoke, they are talking at a purely material level. Prasangika scholars say that there is not the complete picture, that in order to explain mutual dependency fully, both the material and the conceptual side need to be considered. The example often given is fire and fuel. Of course, fire needs fuel to exist, but does fuel need fire to exist? When wood is used in fire, it is fuel, but if it is not, then it is just wood. So we can say that wood does not need fire to be wood, but it does need fire to be fuel. There we have the mutual dependency of fire needing fuel and fuel needing fire. Similarly, there is a mutual dependency between being a commuter and the trip you take to work every day. If you took that route from home to work just once and did not go to work, but go to the supermarket near your work, it would not be commuting, and you would not be a commuter. The action, repeatedly going long distances between home and work, is the necessary condition for the designation commuter. And of course, the person doing the action is the necessary condition for the designation commuting. This kind of mutual dependency relies on designation. As we have seen, an apple seed is the cause of an apple, but the apple is also the cause of the apple seed, in that it is from the resultant apple that the seed is named. And as we will see with the next level of dependency, Because the seed is designated based on its result, there is also merely labeled dependency. These dependencies, as I have said, are not mutually exclusive. Merely labeled dependency. Things and events are not only mutually dependent when they come into being. Prasangika Madhyamaka asserts that an object and the name or label ascribed to it are also mutually dependent. This is the meaning of the third level of dependent arising. Here we need to look at the mere designation or label and the basis of designation, the thing that the label designates. Without the mere designation, there can be no basis of designation, and vice versa. If there is no collection of legs, seat, and back, how can I put the label chair on it? And if there is no label, how can it be more than a collection of parts? A chair leg, no matter how finely turned and well varnished it is no more than a piece of wood until the mind associates it with a chair and labels it a chair leg. This is where we start to see the all-important concept of merely labeled. We say that the I exists as a mere label, and that the I is what is merely designated based on our aggregates. That kind of relationship between designation, the mere label, and the basis of designation, what is merely labeled, is unique to Prasangika Madhyamaka, the middle way consequence school. For the other schools, there is such a thing as a label, but it is designated on a thing that exists from its own side. So quite a different view. So here's a summary, and it's really important if you guys can understand at least the basics of all three levels of dependency. I know I've talked about it in a lot of different angles in this class today, but just really get your head around this king of reasons is that all phenomena are empty of inherent existence because they dependently arise. Dependence is described in three levels. Causal dependency, which is that all impermanent phenomena rely on causes and conditions in order to arise, function, etc. Mutual dependency, all impermanent and permanent phenomena rely on parts and context in order to be understood, used, viewed, etc. Merely labeled dependency, all impermanent and permanent phenomena rely on a valid basis of designation, and the or a mind's imputation to exist, be held in awareness, be engaged with, etc. So just have a look at that for a second. Get it clear in your mind. So I hope those three levels are clear, and those three levels will come back to when we do the middle way consequence view again. Some of the schools really disagree with this view. Some schools agree with parts of it, and a couple of the schools have a totally different presentation, but everyone agrees that there is dualism in our experience. Everyone agrees that things exist in terms of the conventional truth, which is illusory, and ultimate truth, which is accurate. So generally speaking, there's a lot of crossover with all of the Tenets schools, but the middle way school does have some unique features, and it's important to be really clear on them because that's where we're going. So see you next week.